All right. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the webinar. My name is Matt Parker. I'm an attorney with the firm of Marshall, Parker and Weber. Today, we're honored with a guest presenter at this webinar. Her name is Sarah Keyser. She's the funeral director of the Night Confer Funeral Home. It's located right here in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And she has agreed to present an overview of funeral and cremation planning. And Sarah, thank you very much for agreeing to present for us today. And I don't want to take too much of your time. I know you have a lot to go over, so I'm going to turn the presentation over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Matt, and your team there at the PA Elder Law, Marshall, Parker, Weber. I'm excited to be here and spend some time with you all this afternoon. It certainly is a beautiful day here in North Central Pennsylvania, so I hope that you're able to enjoy a little bit of the weather and learn also today here on our Thoughtful Living presentation, where I'll share an overview of funeral and cremation planning. I first like to start and just tell everyone that I am a funeral director here at Night Confer and commend you for joining this webinar to educate yourself about what most consider to be a very difficult topic. There's a lot of stigma when it comes to death and dying, and it's not always easy to take that first step to learn more or to even maybe put plans in place ahead of time. But I hope the information I share with you today will maybe encourage you to do so, or at least give you some things to think about, as we call it, thoughtful living. When you think about death and dying and funeral planning, it can be challenging. And I always encourage folks to think about it differently. So I want you to take a moment as you're kind of sitting there listening to me, and I want you to think about some of your fondest memories. I want you to think about some of your most significant accomplishments. I want you to think about what your family and your friends would say about you. And I want you to think about the ways you wish you would want to be remembered. When we start to think about things this way, we can then transition into thinking about how you might want your final celebration to be planned. When you incorporate things about your life, you are incorporating things that were meaningful to you, but they also become meaningful for your family. So they'll be able to mourn in a way that means something to them, and it'll certainly help them with the grief process. More importantly, when you plan and customize your funeral services, your funeral is going to reflect the real you, especially when you plan it yourself. So we're going to talk a little bit more about these things as we begin here today. So we'll begin with our overview of advanced funeral planning. In this presentation, we're going to talk about what funeral planning really is, why someone should consider it, how you can pay for it, how you do it, and what the next steps would be to complete the process. We're going to help you get started. So we can break the process down like this. Advanced funeral planning is gathering information and gaining awareness. You're going to educate yourself. You're going to learn about all of the options, or as many as you want to learn about, so you can make your own decisions ahead of time. You can learn about finances and costs that would be involved, and you can set the budget to spend what you want to spend on your final celebration. We're going to talk about advanced funeral planning and how money can be set aside in advance, and that would be done so safely and securely to help pay for your expenses when the time comes. Most importantly, we always say planning your funeral, and the main part of advanced funeral planning is eliminating your family from having to make those tough decisions and living so they don't have to live with the guilt of not knowing what you would have wanted. We're going to help inform them of what your wishes are. When we look at advanced funeral planning, we can look at it two ways. Our industry actually calls pre-planning, pre-need. When someone passes away, if there's no plans in place, it becomes at need. So we'll look at this twofold. You'll see here on this screen, the column in green highlights how things would be done pre-need or ahead of time, compared to the yellow side on the right, at need, when death occurs at the time of need. To go back to the far left of the screen, you'll see 3 blocks in white. These 3 blocks in white are 3 things that will need to be done regardless of whether you pre-plan ahead of time or if you plan at the time of need. You will have a selection of funeral goods and services. You can select these items ahead of time pre-need, or you can wait and select them at the time of need. Second main area would be funeral funding. Money has to be set aside in advance pre-need, or the family can provide at the time. And lastly, you have your decision maker. You can make your own decisions ahead of time, or your survivors can make the decisions when you pass away. You're going to get to choose the type of services you want to have, and this is what we call your wishes, your way. This is perhaps a traditional or a contemporary service, a burial or cremation. There's actually a third form of services that can be provided, and that is body donation to science as a form of disposition. Maybe you're interested in that. You can select a church or a memorial service, or maybe you know you're going to pass away on a beautiful day like today and you want just a graveside service. We don't always get to pick the weather here, and we have graveside services even in January and February. We just suggest dressing in a lot of layers. You can also select headstone and monument information, or maybe even apply for a veterans marker if that's something you would be eligible for because you would be an honorably discharged veteran. There are many other miscellaneous items that would be included in selecting the type of service that you want to have.
You know, I was just going to make a comment at this point, Sarah, that as an attorney, obviously I'm dealing with families after someone has passed away, and unfortunately, there seems to be some disputes that break out amongst family as to how the service should be performed, perhaps where the church, what church they would use, and sadly, how the ashes will be disposed of is occasionally a dispute between family members. And all this pre-planning, in your experience, would tend to cut down on a lot of those disputes. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And Matt, thank you for bringing that up. Families don't get along as they once did. I think that we've changed as a society. And if you are a person and maybe you're still married and you have 3 or 4 children, it's very important that maybe you try to get your children on the same page, or you at least designate ahead of time who would be in control of things. But more importantly, you can eliminate some of that by pre-planning. For example, you brought up cremation. In the state of Pennsylvania, you are allowed to sign off on your own cremation ahead of time, and that can be done so with us at the funeral home, any funeral home really, and you can designate where and how you want your remains or your ashes to be divided. Perhaps you have a burial space, or maybe someone will be taking them. Those are things that you can put in place ahead of time, and that certainly does help eliminate a lot of frustration at the time if it's done ahead of time.
Many clients want me to put that in the will, but I tell them nobody's going to read that in the will until you've obviously passed. So setting aside those instructions, maybe in a burial arrangement or other documents, is very important, because the friction between the kids is remarkable after both parents have passed away. It comes to the surface, and there can be some very ugly disputes over things that should not turn ugly.
Absolutely. We see it all the time, and we tell folks, if you want to make sure that your children will still get along after your funeral, you definitely should consider putting plans in place ahead of time. So we talked a little bit there about some of the service aspects that you could decide from, but there's also some very specifics that go along with the details of the type of funeral you may want to have. This goes right back down to your location preference. Church, maybe it's a cemetery. Perhaps your favorite place to be is one of the social establishments in our area and you'd like to have a service there. It's not so out of the norm to have different places arising. Last spring we had a outdoor service at a pavilion, so folks could cast fishing rods right into the river because that's the way they wanted to celebrate their loved one's life. You can also select such as visitation details. This could be telling us if you want to have an open casket viewing, or maybe you want a closed casket, or you want a lot of photos of you instead for folks to come in and pay respects. You can also tell us what you'd want in your obituary right up ahead of time, even select your pallbearers. Pallbearers are something that folks are asking us a lot about lately, especially with cremation, and you can still have pallbearers with cremation, or you may select for one person to carry your urn. So there's lots of different ways you can set up your funeral, especially when it comes to the details. The next area is clothing and flowers, and this is where I will joke and I say, females, ladies out there, if you have some style, you're always the one that likes to match, and you're the one that helps your husband pick out his clothes, you probably want to make sure you point out someone to help pick out your outfit if you were to pass away first. And I will say, my husband won't dare pick out my clothing because I still help him get dressed every day. So there are things that you don't often think about, but we encourage you to think about so you know that you have plans in place as much as you want. Flowers are something else as far as music and reading. These would all be things that are special or meaningful to you. And we encourage you to kind of think about that and maybe provide one or two options. For example, you might really like Christmas and evergreens, but then again, if you pass away in the spring or summer, you might not want those types of flowers at your service. The last section here could be something else that you do ahead of time, and that's your funeral home merchandise. If your wishes are for a traditional burial, then we would suggest that you look at a casket and a vault ahead of time because those are things that you will need as part of your services. If your wishes are for cremation, you may opt to look at different urn choices. So there's lots of things that we can walk you through, and there are lots of options when it comes to funeral home merchandise. This right here is just a small piece of the many things that could be planned ahead of time. There are actually 124 tasks that need done when someone passes away. And out of those 124 tasks, most of them could be done ahead of time. We say half of them. Of that half, there are certain few that would not be able to be changed after the plans are put in motion. So you can see if you make notations and plan in advance, you will not leave your family guessing as to what you really want as part of your services. As part of planning, we always encourage people to think about things that you plan for. So here on this slide, you're going to see the different color blocks. And I want you to maybe think back for some of you, depending on what your age is. You may have to think back a little bit harder, maybe it's a little bit more familiar. But think back to maybe when you got married. Did you plan for your wedding? Okay, maybe you didn't plan for your wedding, but perhaps you have children and you helped your children plan for their wedding. You probably planned for that. And anymore, today's society, we typically plan weddings out at least a year in advance, sometimes even longer. Did you plan for education for yourself or for any of your children? Did you save money for that? How about purchasing a home? Did you just wake up one morning and say, we're going to buy a home today, or did you plan and save money, look at different properties? Maybe you have even had the opportunity to build your dream home. You've probably planned and put some thought into that. The same thing with planning a family. Or maybe more familiar would be that you planned for your retirement. You knew that you were approaching that age, you were feeling that it was coming, and you planned to retire. I also like to tell folks about insurance at this point, and the reason for that is because we plan. It's just something that we do. We plan for those major life events.
Well, that was unexpected. Hopefully Sarah will return in a moment. But part of the point she was trying to make is that we've taken the time to plan throughout our life for these various events. And why wouldn't we take the time to plan for our funeral? After all, we are all going to die. Death and taxes, the two things we cannot avoid in life. So she has the following slide to discuss why people should consider pre-planning my funeral. 90% of them obviously are thinking this is a good idea, so why don't we consider some pre-planning? And as an elder law attorney, I'm dealing with so many of my clients. A lot of them have purchased a life insurance policy for their burial arrangements. It's usually a $5,000 to $10,000 policy, and they sort of earmark that as money for their burial. But they haven't set aside the funds specifically for burial, and therefore the children are often left trying to put together this plan to bury their loved ones at the time they passed away. And kids can essentially have a lot of conflict over these issues, and they're suffering from the loss of their loved one, and it's very difficult to essentially deal with these issues after the loved one has passed away. So Sarah, I think, is trying to get back in. So give me a moment to return her to the event. You're there again, Sarah.
I am here, and
Okay.
I promise that, as Matt, you probably picked up, that was not scripted.
Okay.
But I guess it goes well with what I was speaking about in planning, because you plan for the unexpected, as I was saying. You plan for homeowners insurance in the event of a fire or something that happens to your home. Here we plan for power outages in the funeral home, and we have a backup generator. And I apologize, technology just didn't switch me over fast enough. So what I was getting at with that past slide was that we plan for a lot of things that make sense. And doesn't it make sense to plan for your funeral? And I do apologize, and I'm back. Thank you for your patience and for covering there, Matt.
And Sarah, can you see me
Yes.
still? Okay, so I'm still on. I just wanted to make sure both of us were still here. So I had advanced to this slide, and I was just talking about the large percentage of people think pre-planning is a good idea. So why don't more people do so? It seems to be something they don't do until the very end of their life.
Absolutely. We see a lot of times folks are pre-planning when they're almost being forced to. And you probably see this too, Matt, as this is where we work closely together. If someone's being told they need to live in a nursing home, someone may have to go through a spend down process, and that forces them to look at their assets and pre-plan. So that's one reason why people begin that process. Another reason why people start to pre-plan and consider it is because they're getting to the age that they're planning lots of other things. They've retired, they've planned for that, they've got their house situated, paid off, they've got everything in place, they're getting ready to travel, and they want to be prepared for unexpected things. Why don't people pre-plan? Well, I think it's very hard for some to get started, and we have a hard time personally thinking about that and the end of life. I promise you that if you sit down with one of us or any of our funeral directors, we will try to make it as easy as possible. And this is where I can insert our corny funeral joke saying we will try our best to put the fun in funeral planning. So, to speak a little bit farther, why should you consider pre-planning your funeral? You should certainly consider pre-planning a funeral ahead of time because there are a number of overwhelming decisions that need to be made. I kind of outlined this just a few slides ago when I started to talk about 124 tasks that are decisions and answers that we need. I like folks to think about this too, because if you've lost a loved one, you may be familiar with the scenario of how things happen. Sometimes death occurs and it is very sudden and unexpected. You're in shock, and then all of a sudden you're sitting in front of the funeral director and we're asking you questions saying, we kind of need answers on these things because the state of Pennsylvania tells us we only have 10 days to handle your services. So we need to get to work on it almost immediately. Or maybe you had your loved one at home under hospice care and it was a great thing to have them at home, but the 3 and 4 nights leading up to their passing were really hard nights and you did not get a lot of sleep. That you were feeling, not so great, sleep deprived, and then all of a sudden you're sitting with us at the funeral home and we're going through the same thing again. I'm sorry, you can take a day to think about these and hopefully you can get a good night's sleep tonight, but we're going to need some answers so we can help you plan the funeral. So when you think about that, if you plan in advance, you're going to eliminate a lot of the hard decisions and a lot of the conversations where we have with you saying, no problem. We sat down with you 8 years ago and we have notes. Let me refresh you. Is this still what you want? When you plan in advance, you are not making decisions during a time of duress. You're not sleep deprived. You can remember your life just as you want it, not from those hard couple days leading up to that person's passing. You are not spending more money just because you feel bad out of desperation. We are eliminating emotional overspending when you plan in advance. And most importantly, you have peace of mind knowing that your wishes are going to be done your way and that everything will be taken care of ahead of time. Another reason why folks consider pre-planning, and I started to touch on this a little bit just a few moments ago, and that's, like I said, because someone is applying for nursing home assistance and Medicaid. The reason for this is because our system, as we say, sometimes isn't always set up the best for people who have worked hard their whole life, they've saved money, and they thought that they've done everything right. Except if it comes to the point in your level of care where you need help and you're told that you have to live in a nursing home. And that's where I encourage you all to speak with Matt and his team ahead of time because they can help you. And believe me, I know Matt would much rather work with you now, 5 and 10 years and 15 years before the fact, because his conversation will be something that you will want to hear now versus waiting too long, because then he has to tell you he can only do so much, but if you would have saw me sooner, I could have done this then. And that really comes into play, don't you think, Matt?
Yeah, it does. I mean, there are asset rules with Medicaid. Not everybody will qualify. If you have too much money, people have to restructure their assets. There is planning you can do, typically 5 years before there is a crisis. So one of the reasons this slide is on there is that sometimes people have to spend down their money to become eligible for Medicaid, and setting aside money in a burial account is one of those ways they can become eligible. And I often tell the clients, go set up a contract with the funeral home, outlining all of your needs and wishes for your burial, so that when the county assistance office reviews your application, they won't question the amount of money that you're setting aside. If you do so with a bank and you just set aside a burial CD, it has to be within certain limits. It can't be an unrestricted amount of money for your burial. So it's better to go and see Sarah and set up a contract.
Absolutely. And we do that when folks are told they have to go into a nursing home, and we help them pre-arrange in advance. We look at the cost of what type of funeral they want, what that would actually cost, and we help them set aside that money so it could be protected from the nursing home, so it's there to pay for their funeral expenses. Another area that we get into a lot is, how do I pay for my arrangements? So if you think in the past, you might be familiar with some common ways to pay. You have traditional life insurance. I've got some bullet points here that show you that there's usually a limited dollar benefit, and that just speaks to the point of some people aren't always aware. They may pick a $10,000 funeral and they may only have $5,000 worth of insurance. So we encourage folks to look into that and to know ahead of time. Another reason, life insurance might cause some challenges is because you may originally have that money set up to help with expenses, family expenses, and not so much funeral expenses. One way you can pay for your funeral. We'll talk a little bit more about life insurance in a minute and how you can also protect that and assign it over to make sure that it's there to pay for expenses if that's your wish. A second way would be your family and friends. I always tell folks that you can absolutely rely on them to pay for your expenses. Just know that it may cause emotional stress and put some financial burden on them. And most importantly, if you tell me that so-and-so will be paying for your funeral ahead of time, I'm going to say, let's pick up the phone and call them to make sure they know that. You may have personal savings, the third way, to cover funeral expenses. And a lot of folks do have money saved and in the bank. Just know that we're not always sure when death happens and how it will occur. And if you had a few hospital stays and outstanding medical costs prior to passing, you may have depleted that balance in your account. May not be there for your funeral expenses. We get lots of folks anymore that want to pay with a credit card, and that's fine. I like to pay with a credit card because they offer great perks, and that's one way you can do it. It's just not always the most feasible for everyone because you might not have credit available, or you could be subject to a rather high interest rate. So as we get into another way to pay, I just want to stop for a moment and speak a little bit about how we do insurance assignments, because this is something that I touched on here in point one, but to speak further about that. Traditional, life insurance is one way that a lot of folks plan to pay for their funeral. But we also say you need to make sure that that policy is set up the right way to do so. And Matt will be able to talk about this too here, I'm sure, in a second. But what we say at the funeral home is, let's look at that policy, and maybe we want to do an assignment on it, or maybe even change some ownership of that policy to make sure that if you were to go into a nursing home, that the funds of that policy are still there and are still able to pay for your funeral expenses.
Yeah, we obviously are working with people who are applying for Medicaid, and they have this insurance policy, and what we need to do is make sure the ownership is transferred to the funeral home and the beneficiary becomes the funeral home. So the money is set aside for the burial, and you can do that even though you're applying for assistance. The transfer of life insurance to a funeral home can be done. It's not a disqualifying transfer. So that's something that goes on a lot with our Medicaid clients.
Absolutely. And we're happy to help fill out that paperwork if that's something you'd want to do. Every life insurance company is a bit different with the forms that they require. So we certainly say that's probably best if we were to have a one-on-one phone conversation or a meeting about, and we can help you look a little bit closer at your life insurance and what would need to be done to make sure that that's protected in there. So let's talk about the last way to pay for expenses. And this might be one way you're not familiar with, or maybe you are starting to learn a little bit about it here, hopefully today. And that would be setting up an irrevocable funeral account. This is what we say is another way to pay. What is an irrevocable funeral account? It is a funeral specific life insurance or annuity policy that's set up, and it's designed to pay for your funeral expenses only. You may be familiar with an irrevocable account at a banking establishment or maybe a CD. They're all designed similar, but some have differences. How these work, you basically would sit down with us. We would go over what your wishes are and all the details, as much of the details as you want to do, or as few of the details as you want to do. And then we would talk about the cost, and then we could figure out how we could set up an account this way for what you want. It would be designed, as I said, to pay just for your funeral expenses. And then when the time of need comes, we would provide all of the services for you that you selected, and those funds would be readily available to pay us directly for your funeral. The key word here to these accounts is that it's irrevocable. And the irrevocable account simply means to us, as we would say to you, is that once the money goes in, it can only come out to pay for your funeral expenses. And that is what completely protects the account to make sure that the money is there.
One of the questions I had about these accounts, and it gets asked of me all the time when they set up these accounts, what if the funeral home goes out of business, which I don't know if that's a realistic concern. I hear of funeral homes being bought out, they change ownership over time. But they do ask, the clients do ask me about that. And the second question they ask is, what if I move out of the area? What if I set it up, when I'm 75, but by the time I'm 85, I've moved either to another part of the state, or maybe I've moved away to live with my child in another state. Could you just touch on that?
Absolutely. And those are great questions, very familiar with them, and to address them. What if we do go out of business, or God forbid something happens to our funeral home? The good news is the funds are set up in your name, and they are 100% transferable to any other funeral home that accepts US currency. So perhaps you just don't like us anymore and you want to go to another funeral home in town. Your policy, your funds, it pays them there. You're just subject to pay whatever their costs are, even though it was set up towards ours.
Good.
Secondly, folks do travel. We're traveling a lot more. We see snowbirds. Folks might decide, I'm just going to live in Florida all year, and I don't think I need to come back to Pennsylvania for my cremation. And if that's the case, the same thing. Your policy will go with you, and it will pay that funeral home as well. I have to tell you, the key is that if you were to go to a different country, it's by US currency only, and you would just be subject to paying whatever the expenses are at that funeral home. But all the money that you put into that account plus interest would be credited right back towards your expenses.
That's great, thanks.
So to recap what we did here, how do you pre-plan? You're going to first complete a planning guide. And for all of you that are participating with us here today, if you just would want to provide your information, we would be glad to drop a free planning guide in the mail to you, which is basically a fill in the blank and a great way to get started. That's your first step to pre-planning, of course, after listening to this webinar today. The second step would be, let's take things one step farther and discuss with the funeral home what my wishes really are, and make sure I didn't miss anything in thinking about the process. Third step would be, let's establish some funding options and decide what might be the best way to prepay or to fund my funeral when the time comes. And lastly, let's make sure that plans are readily available. It is great to note things in a will, but just as Matt said earlier, it's often not read when funeral plans are put in place. These plans, we often say, should be kept in your home or given a copy somewhere else because a bank account safety deposit box is not a good place for them. And that's because death may occur Friday at 7 p.m. Depending on your bank, it may or may not be open on Saturday and Sunday. And therefore, you may have already sat down with the funeral home over the weekend till you have access to that safety deposit box. So make sure those plans are in a safe place and readily available. We also offer at absolutely no cost to keep plans on file for you here in the funeral home in a fireproof safe, which we have for many folks and we've done for many years. So just to make sure things are there and ready. So to review, what is advanced funeral planning? It's planning the details of your final celebration before the need arises. Why should you consider pre-planning? Do it for yourself for the peace of mind, but then think about the people you love to take the emotional and financial burden off of your family. How do you pre-plan? You complete a planning guide. You can discuss it with us at the funeral home, and then make sure those plans are in a place where they can be accessible. How do you pay for it? Establish your funding options, and perhaps you might want to speak with your attorney and then pre-plan with an irrevocable funeral account from our funeral home or whichever funeral home you choose. What's your next step? Sign up for a one-on-one consultation. You could certainly give Matt a call, set up a time to meet with him. Perhaps you might want to do the same with us here at the funeral home. I think that you'll get some pretty good advice from both of us, and that's what we would encourage you to do.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it, joining us today. Do visit the Night Comfort Funeral Home if you are in the Williamsport area. They do have a website, and we put the website information on this slide. And if you want to learn more about our firm or any upcoming webinars, you may visit our site at paelderlaw.com. Thank you all for joining. I appreciate you being here today.
Thank you. Thank you as well, Matt. Have a great afternoon.